Good morning and welcome to Church of the Rock. We are so glad you chose to worship with us today. My name is Sue and I want to officially welcome you this morning. In front of you, if you're a new time visitor, you will find a welcome card. Fill that out and put it in the offering plate and we'll be sure to get in touch with you later. We've been talking to you about FCA, Fellowship of Christian Athletes. The camp is getting closer and closer. We need kids. If you are the ages between 6 and 12, or you know people who are ages between 6 and 12, we have an awesome week for them planned. You can sign up through the website that you can see right now on the screen. The capital campaign is well underway. We've showed you the new displays today, and we want to thank you for all that you've given to us. We're at $86,000. We're creeping up to $220,000, which is the final count to take care of it all. Thank you for your faithfulness and continue to pray about how you can bless this church and the future generations with your gifts. Thanks for being faithful and listening up to our video announcements. Now it's time for you just to enjoy the sermon, sit back and see what God has in store for you. Thank you.
Well, we're talking about rebuilding. And rebuilding involves physical things. It also involves much deeper things that go on in our lives. And I want to take you there this morning as we look at the story of a man named Nehemiah. He was a government official, high-placed government official in what was the largest empire of the time, the Persian Empire. He was the cupbearer to the king. Doesn't sound like much. He was not just a waiter. He drank the wine before the king did, so that if it was poisoned, he went first. But he was also a confidant to the king, and the king made him the governor of the land around Jerusalem. That's how prominent he was. Nehemiah was a man with a vision, and his vision was to rebuild a destroyed city and to rebuild the society that would live inside that city. We sang just a moment ago about the alabaster cities, that perpetual dream that we have as a society, that somehow we can get it all together and we can create a country and a culture that is a shining light for everybody else. And just follow the current events and you can see how much of a struggle that is. But Nehemiah wanted to do that from the ground up. In the ancient world, the city was seen as the greatest accomplishment of a society. It stood as a place of order, a place of safety in a chaotic world. The city provided people in those days with everything that you needed in order to live. Protection, food, water, employment, commerce, art, entertainment. The city was seen as the earthly home of the gods. And so for the Jewish people, the city of Jerusalem was all of those things, and it was the place where God chose to dwell. We are used to having a society and having technology that has basically turned our whole country into what they would have considered to be a city. In that we don't worry about wild animals, we don't have problems with water supplies or food or access to entertainment and so on, protection. And so in a way, we've sort of expanded city so that all of Vermont is like a city to us. But in those days, without those technologies, the city was the place that was safe. The city was the thing that showed that you had it all together. And so when a city was destroyed by a conquering army, it was the end of the society. It was the complete destruction of everything that held those people together. And this is what had happened to Jerusalem. The Babylonians had conquered and leveled the city in 587 BC. Now, 143 years later, Nehemiah has a vision of rebuilding Jerusalem's walls and gates, making it a place for a city to rise again. The Jewish people had been allowed to come back for over about 70 years, but they came back to a destroyed and ruined place, and they lived in the rubble. They basically were camping in the ruins of what had once been a beautiful and glorious city. Now Nehemiah wanted to restore that city to its splendor and make it a place where God could dwell with his people. Like Nehemiah, every one of us has a city to rebuild. Did you know that you yourself are a city, a little tiny microcosm of what it means for God to be present in this world? He says that we are his temple. And in that ancient sense, that means that we're the place where God would live. The city was the place where the temple would be, and you yourself are a little mini city, a place where God wants to bring His order and bring His love and bring His forgiveness and bring His goodness and truth and His justice, so that you become everything God meant for you to be. But the most powerful cities that we build are built with others. A marriage, a family, a church. Together we build and we strengthen gates and walls and create something bigger than ourselves, something that can become God's home in a way far greater than any one of us alone. And it was never God's purpose that we just do that in some singular isolation, but rather that we be a community gathered around Him, His family. Together we build gates that lead into our shared space, that allow people to come into God's presence. One day we're going to see the fulfillment of this glorious building project that God is doing. Lee talked about how the sanctuary is going to be a mess for 5 weeks. Well, I look in the mirror and I see a building project that's a mess for years. He's always working on something, isn't he? But one day the work gets done. And John pictured the fulfillment of God's purpose for this world in terms of a city. Listen to what he says about the new Jerusalem, Revelation 21, verses 10 and 12. And the angel carried me away in the Spirit to a mountain great and high and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. It shone with the glory of God, and its brilliance was like that of a very precious jewel, like a jasper, clear as crystal. It had a great high wall with 12 gates, and with 12 angels at the gates, and on the gates were written the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. You see, in the language of the Bible, the picture of perfection, the picture of the human race as it ought to be, and of human society as it ought to be, is pictured in terms of a city. A city that had been destroyed and it had now been completely restored. But the journey from that vision that Nehemiah had of a beautiful city once again rebuilt to the reality of it actually happening, the journey from the dream to it actually taking place, requires that we travel through the valley of uncertainty. Anyone who's ever undertaken a complicated rebuilding project knows that before you fix things, you have to know exactly what's broken. Vision requires a hard dose of reality. You know what happens to a vision or a plan in your head if you never do the hard work of getting a dose of reality to go along with it? Your vision becomes a daydream. I've got certain daydreams in my head that I think about, and they're wonderful, and they're perfect. And every time I think of them, everything works just the way it's supposed to. And you know what? They'll never happen. They'll never happen. They're just an escape place to go. You know, before I go to bed, I might think about doing something that I know in reality I'm never going to do. But it just makes me feel good for a little bit. But it never happens because I haven't applied that hard dose of reality. Nehemiah tells us that the first thing he did, and if you're reading the book of Nehemiah, it's all written by Nehemiah. It's like he's talking about what he did. He says, I did this and I did that. This is the first person. This is his diary, if you will. He tells us the first thing he did after arriving in Jerusalem was make a nighttime inspection of the ruins of Jerusalem. In Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, he says, I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with a few others. I had not told anyone about what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There were no mounts with me, no horses, except the one I was riding on. So you see, before Nehemiah goes out and starts pitching the dream and talking about what it could look like and getting people excited, he had to have a hard dose of reality. He had to know exactly what he was getting into. No shortcuts. No pumping up the crowd with short-lived enthusiasm. No tipping his hand to the many enemies that would oppose the building of those walls and would oppose Jerusalem becoming a powerful city again. He kept his own counsel, and he went out under the cover of night to see things for himself. I've put up a little map here that shows the restored city as it's been pictured Now you have to imagine it before it looks all pretty like that. Walls are knocked down, but he took this journey that starts in the upper center of the picture and goes down to the left and goes all the way around till he hits so much rubble he couldn't go any further and turns around and comes back. We read in verses 14 and 15, I moved on to the fountain gate and the king's pool, but there wasn't enough room for my mount to get through. So I went up the valley by night, examining the wall. I turned around, and re-entered through the valley gate. Nehemiah had this dream. He'd had it perhaps a year or two before. He had come to the king. He'd gotten permission to build the city. He'd gotten the stuff together, had his letter, his permissions. He'd traveled with an entourage. He came in as the governor of the whole province, and now he was ready to take charge. The first thing he does is give himself a hard dose of reality, a hard look at what needs to be done. How bad is it really? You know what? A lot of times I'm sure we tell ourselves, well, I know it's going to be hard. And then when we get there, guess what? Well, I didn't know it'd be this hard. I mean, he got on a horse that night to ride around the walls. He never thought he'd have to get off the horse, but he couldn't even get the horse through the rubble. He had to see that for himself. And having then taken that walk that night in the valley of uncertainty, he was now ready to take his vision to a discouraged and beaten down people so they could begin to rebuild this city. This is what he says in verse 16 to 18. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, because as yet I had said nothing to the Jews or the priests or the nobles or officials or any others who'd be doing the work. Then I said to them, you see the trouble we're in. You see the trouble we're in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. Wow, and that little verse there, you have his whole message. And then he says, I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king has said to me. Nehemiah's message was simple and to the point. Number one, current reality. The city's in ruins. You see the trouble we're in. You know how bad it is. You guys live here. You're the ones who go to bed at night and don't know whether you'll be safe during the night or whether your family or your home will be intact in the morning. You know what it's like. You're the pioneers. You're the adventurous ones who've come here, but you're living in squalor and poverty and disgrace while those around you are taking advantage of you. You see the current reality. Now he comes with vision. He says, but we can fix this. Let's rebuild this. If somebody knocked it down, we can put it back up. Let's tackle this project. And then finally he says, God has opened the way. God has opened the way. He's given us a time. He's given us resources. He's given us favor so that we can do something now that we couldn't have done before. Now think about what it would have been like to live in the ruins of that city for 70 years. That's 2 generations. And then along comes a guy from out of town who says, hey, this place is a mess. Let's fix it. You know what happens when you live in a mess long enough? The mess becomes the new normal. Do you ever go buy a new car and all of a sudden realize how old your last one was? You get in and I know they put the little smell in there. Ed can tell us how they do that. But all of a sudden it doesn't squeak, it doesn't rattle, and it's getting better gas mileage. All these things are happening and you're going, whoa. I never realized how old the other car was. Why? Because you were in it and getting used to it. Same thing happens when things are broken in our lives. We get used to broke. We get used to broken relationships. We get used to lack of good communication in a family or in a marriage or even at work. We get used to problems in our society that we just say, well, they just can't ever be fixed. Well, that's just the way it is. And so we put our heads down and we just assume that this trouble, that these life-threatening problems in our society just will never go away. Until somebody comes along and says, we can fix that. We can rebuild that. I remember as a missionary in Africa, as a young man, one of the great scourges of little children was dehydration. A child would get sick. Whatever the disease might be, it might just be an intestinal bug or something like that. And if you know anything about little kids, you have to keep them hydrated. And if they don't have enough fluid, if they have diarrhea or if whatever type of infection, if they don't have enough fluids, then they will die just for lack of having enough water and electrolytes in their system. And so the missionaries had come up with a very simple formula of water, a little bit of sugar, a little bit of salt. You stir them together, and then a teaspoon every 5 minutes. And they found that would keep a child alive. Even though you didn't have an IV and you didn't have medical treatment, you could just hold this little child while they were fighting the fever and fighting the infection and just keep trickling a little bit of fluid into them and they would live. But time and time and time again, when someone would come and share this with a mother whose baby was dying, the mother would say, "No, it won't work. She's going to die. I can look at her." Well, of course, you could look at the child and see the signs of dehydration and the signs of the fever. They had lived with death for so long. They didn't have a vision for doing something that they hadn't done before that would almost certainly save that little life. And I wonder how many times that comes into our experience, where we just get used to broken. We just get used to junky. We get used to less than how it could be. For Nehemiah, that meant coming to people who were doing their best to make it work and saying, "You know what? We can rebuild this. This is a new time. Yes, I've looked at it. I've seen how broken it is. No, I'm not sugarcoating what we have to do. This will be the hardest thing we ever tackled, but it'll be worth it." You see, Nehemiah had an answer for each twist and turn that these people would face in the valley of uncertainty. Now, if you're facing a rebuilding in your life, whatever that might be, it might be a new journey in your health experience. It might be overcoming something that has enslaved you or some sort of an addiction. It might be learning how to forgive or learning how to communicate with the people that you love, even though you may have been together for years. You may have lived half of a lifetime without those tools and without that healing. As you go into that, understand the path requires a nighttime journey around the walls. It requires a hard dose of reality. It requires conversations with those who care about you and love you, who may have to say things that you don't want to hear. I don't know about you, but the one thing I don't want to hear is what I did wrong. I mean, the minute I think someone's going there, whoo, all the walls go up and no, the fear response. But I've never gotten better unless those conversations have happened. And I'm sure you could say the same thing. So understand, as we go into a place of rebuilding, first of all, we take that journey into the valley of uncertainty. Lee kind of spelled that out for you in physical terms for us. Beginning at the end of this month, this room's going to get all blown up. And you're going to poke your head through the door and you're going to go, "Ah!" And yes, for several weeks we're going to have you in folding chairs or chairs from the back of the building or the other chairs that we have here. We're all going to get in and we're just going to sort of camp in here for a few Sundays and we're going to have a good time. But we're going to be looking around, kind of wondering, how are they ever going to pull this off? How is this going to look when it's done? Valley of uncertainty. Well, when Nehemiah finished speaking, the people of Jerusalem rose to the challenge. Verse 18, the end of the verse, gives us the response. They replied, "Let's start rebuilding." So they began this good work. That must have been an amazing moment for Nehemiah, right? And here he comes all this way. I wonder if they'll do it. I wonder if they are just too beaten down or too used to their new normal. He takes his trip and he puts it all together and he's praying his eyes out. And finally he gives them the speech, which was probably a lot longer than the verse that we read. And the response is, when they took the vote, they said, we're in. We're all in. Let's start rebuilding. And so he says they began this good work. Do you hear an echo there in that phrase, this good work? An echo of the great creation story in Genesis. Creation was God's work, and he declared that it was good. Now it was time to restore a crown jewel in God's creation. It was time to rebuild. It was time to rebuild a city, but even more importantly, it was time to rebuild a community. It was time to rebuild people. It was time to rebuild generations of people. Not just prominent individuals, but moms and dads and boys and girls, the people that were called to be God's people. It was time to build a place where God could dwell with his people. And you see, rebuilding God's creation is good work. Whatever God has called you to rebuild, understand it's good work. It's not just work. It's not just, I wish somebody else had fixed this, or why did I let this get to this point, or whatever. No, this is good work. And so they began this good work. Boy, I would love to have that be a slogan that was attached to my name. And so he began this good work. Because that means we're joining God in what he's doing. No matter the voices of derision and hate, no matter the slander and false charges that the enemies would bring against this project, Nehemiah put his trust in God alone. When the opposition started, Nehemiah responded this way in verse 20. I answered them by saying, the God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, his enemies, you will have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it. You know, he's saying, we're not going to pull this off in our own strength. We're God's servants. We'll do our part. We're going to start this project. He's the one that's going to make it come to pass. Now, whenever you take the step to rebuild, whenever you take the step to change something in a relationship, to maybe grow the marriage stronger, or to bring a better parenting into your children's lives, or whatever the case might be, you can be sure that the old way of doing things is going to push back. And people who don't have the vision are going to say, what are you doing that for? And why would you do that? And do you think you're better than us? And on and on and on it will go. That's why you need to know that this is a God thing. That this good work is joining God in his good work of rebuilding his world. Not allow a broken world to take away from you the vision that God has given you. As a church, we've heard the same call to rebuild. Obviously, we're talking about some physical things that need to happen. But there are some gates I want to talk to you about, and we'll be talking about these over the course of the summer. Gates that need to be rebuilt. What's a gate do? A gate lets people in. It allows the world to come and go. Ourselves and others. Some of you are visiting with us this morning. You're our guests this morning. We're so thankful and blessed to have you with us. But we want to have good gates. We don't want to just be a church with walls by any means, but a church with good gates. And in my own nighttime inspection of the gates, I've been kind of looking at things and trying to figure out in my own spirit about what gates could be built even stronger and better to make us even more accessible and a better place for people to be. And I'm just name 3 of them for you, and you'll hear these again and again. The gate of hospitality, the gate of worship, and the gate of our family ministries. Every Sunday, we have the opportunity to fling wide open the gates of hospitality, of being able to welcome not just each other, but anybody who comes. Maybe it's their first time. There was a first time for each one of us. I know that. I remember my first time coming to Church of the Rock. I was scared to death. I was trying out for a job too, but I was scared to death. I didn't know what was going to happen. And so for you, today may be the first time. Or it may be you can remember that time. We can build a gate of hospitality. We've got great people working to greet and to help and to serve, and we can expand that team. The gate of worship, everything that happens in here, from the time you sit down to the time we close the service. Wonderful folks helping make it happen, but we can do even more. And then there's that other church that's meeting right now. The one that Jesus loves the most, by the way. The one down the hall. The children's ministry, the nurseries, and the preschool, and the kids' church. And by extension, our youth program, family ministries. For far too long, those ministries have gone along with a few, they've been like the Marines, right? A few good men and women. And we need to find ways to make that gate, which is the gate by which a child comes into an understanding of who Jesus is, to make that gate as wide and as welcoming as possible. No one person can rebuild these gates for a new time, a new generation. But together, we're going to do it. We're going to build a new, fresh place where we meet God and welcome those He's drawing into His kingdom. So what do you say? Let's start rebuilding. It's God's time, and He promises us His success. I'm going to ask the worship team to come back up if they would. We are going to now, at this time, invite you to the Lord's table. I talk about a gate, the gateway into His gift of love, forgiveness, of eternal life, be part of His family. And every time we come and partake of the bread and the cup, we're celebrating that reality. If Jesus is your Lord, you are welcome to come. Doesn't matter what your church affiliation is. And what we will do is we will serve you the bread and the cup and then ask you to take them back to your seat so that we can all partake together when everyone has been served. So I'll ask that those who are serving the Lord's table come down. Please join us and be preparing your heart for this time.